Welcome to World History. Today we're going to cover where the French Revolution really goes off the rails and starts getting pretty intense, a time period called the Reign of Terror. So we're clearly moving past our, quote, good revolution and into the revolution that we might think is not quite as good. So we're going to hopefully be able to identify the important events in the rise of the Jacobins, explain how the French Revolution changed the way that war was being fought in Europe, and then analyze the justification for and the effects of this era called the Reign of Terror. So let's get the heads rolling here. When we last left our heroes, France was unbelievably divided over a bunch of issues, including who could be a citizen, what should happen to the king, who should have control of the government, how comfortable we are with armed sans-culotte, poor sort of workers, more or less rising up and taking control over things. So the leaders of the National Assembly at this point decided that what France really needed was a good, quick, unifying war in order to convince everybody that, we're all Frenchmen together, and shouldn't we join together and beat the Austrians? And so France decided to declare war on Austria. And this is really going to change a lot of different things within the French Revolution, because now the revolutionaries have an exterior enemy to fight. France and Austria had been enemies for a long time, and so you've got this massive war along the frontier, which at first the French really struggle in the war, but eventually they sort of get their footing. In order to fight this war, because of course wars are unbelievably expensive, and as we remember, the thing that started this whole French Revolution was the fact that the French government was broke. So where did they get the money to actually fight this war? They decided to take the money from the church. Basically, the French revolutionaries decide that they're going to confiscate all of the church lands within France, because, of course, France was a predominantly Catholic nation, and so the Catholic Church had a lot of territory in France. They're going to take these lands, and then they're going to give them away and sell them to people in order to make money for the war. Obviously, stealing land from the church is a good way to make money, but there's some pretty severe costs to this. And so in order to make sure that the priests went along with this, they also forced them to take something called the civic oath, which is an oath of loyalty to the nation, which was very problematic for the priests because they already had oaths to God and to the Pope that this oath might have violated. And so, although the civic oath and the creation of the assignat, which is this new currency based on the stolen church lands, although it did help finance the war effort, it created some more unrest, especially amongst a lot of the priests who were unhappy that they were being asked to, one, give away all their land, and two, potentially compromise their religious values. And so, far from unifying France, these actions of the revolutionaries, both the war and the sort of forced conscription, because of course they needed to recruit people for the French army, so they would basically gather up a bunch of poor peasants and force them to go fight, which the peasants didn't particularly like, and the restrictions on the church and the stealing of church land led to a massive revolt in a number of regions in France. And so in the Vendée region, and in a number of the more wealthy cities, we started to see revolts. And so the French Revolution is now in a significant amount of trouble because they, on the one hand, have a war with Austria, sort of in the northeastern part of the country. They've got a revolt in the northwestern part of the country, and then more revolts in the southern part of the country. So just as the French Revolution is starting to break under the pressure, they have all of these new problems to deal with that they're going to have to try to put down. And so lots more pressure on the revolutionaries, which is what pushes them in this increasingly radical direction as the revolutionaries in Paris try to deal with this whole host of other problems. And so it's with all these situations that we get our first real massive armed revolution. Georges Danton mobilizes the street mobs of Paris, these whole groups of sans-culottes, and they go and overthrow the National Assembly. They force the delegates out. They also go and seize control of the king. And then massacre the king's bodyguard, as we can see here, hacking them to bits. And so just like that, the National Assembly is swept away, and a group called the Paris Commune, the government of Paris itself, seizes control of all of France, under the leadership of the Jacobins and Georges Danton. One of the effects of this turn is they decide that the king is a traitor to the nation. And so they put him on trial, going back through all of his actions over the whole course of the revolution. They accuse him of trying to flee the country during the flight to Varennes and bring a foreign army back in to destroy them. And so there's this very public trial. And in the end, the king is found guilty and is sentenced to die. And so just like that, the former theoretical absolute ruler of France is marched up onto a public execution stage and is killed by this new device that the French revolutionaries have invented called the guillotine. A weighted blade falls and the king's head is severed. It's supposed to be a cleaner, fairer, more rational way to kill people, as opposed to sort of older, messy styles of death. But the guillotine becomes one of the symbols of the French Revolution, because the death of the king is just the first of a number of deaths we're going to be talking about here. With France under attack from all sides, there's a decision made that democracy is a little bit too messy in this situation. And so, although the National Assembly and the National Convention are going to keep meeting, all power is going to be vested in one small committee known as the Committee of Public Safety. This committee is now going to have the power to appoint people to speak in their name, and all of the sort of laws and checks and balances and limits on governmental power are going to get thrown out as power falls to Georges Danton here, and especially Maximilien Robespierre. So these Jacobins are going to seize full control of the government of France, and the legislature is still going to meet, but they're going to be powerless. And now this one committee is going to have all the power within the French Revolution. The Committee of Public Safety is going to use that power to significantly increase the power of the army. They're going to try to mobilize or prepare for war all of French society. Now that this committee has all power, they're going to put a guy named Lazare Carnot in charge of the army, who's going to recruit every man that he can grab and throw them into the army. They're going to divide them up and put in charge soldiers who know what they're doing in order to help train up these groups of people. But what this is really going to mean is the French armies are just going to be significantly larger than any army they're going to go up against, because now they're basically recruiting anyone who can hold a gun to go join the French army. And so the French are going to start outnumbering their opponents 2, sometimes 3 times to 1, which is going to lead to a massive turn in the war itself. With the French armies finally gaining an upper hand, the Committee of Public Safety decides to move against their enemies. The Reign of Terror was an attempt to destroy the enemies within France that the revolutionaries thought were trying to bring down the revolution. So, for example, if a general loses a battle, he's going to be immediately put to death by the Committee of Public Safety for treason. If people oppose any of these new governmental restrictions, they're going to be rounded up and put to death. If anyone speaks out against the National Assembly, they're going to be put to death. And so the Reign of Terror is the time period in which the Committee of Public Safety decides to basically kill all their enemies in order to try to protect the spirit of the French Revolution, while of course throwing out all of those sort of rights that they originally spoke for. And so in regions that go into revolt, there are going to be mass executions. And in Paris itself, they're going to be, again, executing anyone who speaks out or stands up against the government. With the war going well, Robespierre now sort of goes off the deep end. He ends up suffering what we think is a mental breakdown, and he starts more or less executing everyone at the height of what's called the Great Terror. So Robespierre is going to turn on both both royalists and conservatives, and also turn on his radical allies, including at one point putting Danton, one of Robespierre's former closest allies, on trial and executing him. And so the Reign of Terror stops becoming about saving the spirit of the French Revolution and becomes much more about keeping Robespierre in power as he increasingly erratically starts to randomly execute people who he thinks might challenge him. And so what was Robespierre trying to do with all the power that he'd amassed? Well, in his mind, he was trying to create something called the Republic of Virtue, where he killed anyone who didn't live up to his perfect rational standards and tried to create a new world based on rationality. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to come up with a whole new series of months to sort of untie the months from religion. We're going to try to destroy Christianity in general and create a new religion based on rationality again, and we're going to create a new religion based on rationality and science as opposed to what they saw as superstition. And so they're going to come up with the new slogan, "Death is an eternal sleep," as opposed to any sort of mention of heaven. And again, we're going to execute anyone who challenges us. So that's where we're going to leave the French Revolution today, with Robespierre trying to create this new world of rationality with himself as this glowing, perfect figure, and anyone who doesn't live up to his perfect standards dying via guillotine. So hopefully you can identify the important events that led to the rise of the Jacobins, explain how the French Revolution changed the way that wars are fought, and then look at how the Reign of Terror went from an attempt to save the French Revolution to Robespierre's attempt to keep power and create a rationalistic death cult with himself as sort of the center.